Welcome to this Take 20 special on the final days of Jesus. I'm Pastor Phil Moser, and we invite you to take 20 minutes a day with us as we look back at those final days of Jesus' life. Now, in our previous lesson, we spoke of the triumphal entry. The crowds cheered as Jesus arrived in Jerusalem. Now, while Christians traditionally see Palm Sunday as a day of celebratory worship and Good Friday as a day of reflection, in the gospel record it was a day of superficial, if in a sense maybe even hypocritical worship of Jesus. Now remember, throughout Jesus' presentation as Messiah, 4 steps took place. Jesus would claim to be Messiah and God, and the people would accept him superficially. Jesus would test them, and finally the people would reject him. These 4 steps will culminate in this week we know as Passion Week. On Palm Sunday, they would cheer him as king. And on Monday and Tuesday of Passion Week, Jesus will accept the claim to be king and take back the Temple Mount. In fact, Mark reminds us that once he cleansed the temple, he refused to let anyone pass through it. He is testing them, and before the week is out, they will have had enough, and they'll reject him outright. Remember, William Barclay, the commentator, said, Jesus approached Jerusalem on Palm Sunday with the shout of the mob hailing a conqueror in his ears. It must have hurt him, for they were looking in him for the very thing which he refused to be. Now, on the previous day, Palm Sunday, you may remember that Jesus rode into town, dismounted the colt, and walked up to the temple. In fact, Mark recounts it this way. And he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now notice how Jesus examines the temple, but doesn't actually do anything on Palm Sunday. Since the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., and since most of us didn't grow up in a Jewish background, maybe a bit of background in history may be helpful before we continue the story. Now, you'll see in this simplified picture that the temple was the centerpiece of the city of Jerusalem during Jesus' time. There's a couple of points that are noteworthy here. The temple was located on the eastern side of the city. In fact, it's the centerpiece, really. You can see to the northern portion, that tower, that's Antonia's tower. That's the tower that where the guards would have remained. You can see also off further to the east, the Kidron Valley falls off, and there, off the Kidron Valley, is where you will find the Mount of Olives. So all of that's important in our story together. You'll also notice that Herod's temple was located in the center of the Temple Mount. Now, this is different than the Temple Mount, that whole walled area. The temple itself was a building of approximately 150 feet above the ground. That's pretty tall. In fact, for perspective, our steeple here at Fellowship Bible Church is only about 45 feet above the ground, so the temple would have been 3 times that. Or, for another perspective, the Commodore Barry Bridge between Pennsylvania and New Jersey is about 190 feet off the river, and so that gives you a perspective just how large this building was. Now, outside of the temple itself was a smaller courtyard, and that held the altar from which animal sacrifices were made. Closer to you on the diagram there was the court of the women, and outside of that was a wall. Gentiles could not pass beyond that wall. Now note this about the court of the women. That wasn't only where the women gathered, that was only where the women could go no further into the rest of the temple courtyard. And so that was often a teaching place, a place where scribes would gather and begin to teach or instruct in kind of a Socrates kind of method. Now, to take a further view, a bird's eye view from that temple, you can see where the court of the Gentiles is. Now, the other nations were invited to come there and pray to Israel's God. This is a massive complex in biblical times. To give you a feel for how large it is, actually, you need to just imagine that this Temple Mount under Herod's time was roughly 36 acres. It was so large that you could put about 30 or so football fields within it. But to really help you see the size and scope, we're going to take a brief 3D tour, which is put forth by Immersive History. Just watch, enjoy, and stand in awe. Welcome back. I trust you begin to understand the size and scope of that temple in which it was a part of Jesus' day. Now, the court of the Gentiles plays a really important role in Monday's events of the Passion Week, because this is the setting from which Jesus overturns the tables. In fact, I'll just pick up the reading at Mark chapter 11, verse 15. And they, that is the disciples, came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying, Is it not written, My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers? And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because the crowd was astonished at his teaching. Now, just to fully understand this, I need to give you a little bit more history as well. The Sadducees, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, you may remember, but the Sadducees maintained control of the Temple Mount. During this time, the high priests were actually appointed not by the Jewish people, but by Rome. In fact, Rome overruled Israel at the time, right? So Annas and Caiaphas were the high priests during the time of Jesus. Caiaphas was Annas' son-in-law, and Annas was wise to keep it all in the family because there was a ton of money made by the high priest. In fact, some historians actually called this time where Annas would set everything up on the Temple Mount prime property, Annas' bazaar, because he had so much for sale. By this time, the buying and selling had become commonplace at the temple campus. It was so profitable that it crept out into the court of the Gentiles. Remember that area that we see where the Gentiles were supposed to gather. Now picture this. Over 2/3 of this massive complex was intended for the Gentiles, that is the non-Jewish people, to come and pray. God's heart, even in the Old Testament, was for all people. And Jesus enters the temple the day before and looks around, and then he leaves. His heart must have been burdened by what he saw. Well, it was late. Things were probably kind of shutting down, like a mall closing early. That night, 2 passages must have been burning in Jesus' heart, because the next day he will teach from these 2 passages, Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. Because the very day he puts the 2 together is the day that he clears the temple. Listen to Isaiah 56. And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, these I will bring to my holy mountain, that's Jerusalem, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Remember, that's what Jesus references. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer, listen to this, for all peoples. The very place that had been created, those 30 plus acres, for Gentiles to come in their brokenness with their needs and pray, that's the place that Annas and Caiaphas and the high priest and all of the religious leaders had now made the place to take money from. In fact, the court of the Gentiles was specifically designed to invite the world at large to worship the true and living God. Words like foreigners and Gentiles communicate this truth. It was to have been maybe like the largest evangelistic courtyard where Gentile seekers could bring their broken hearts, kneel in prayer, and have a Jewish brother or sister come alongside of them and pray with them and introduce them to their God who abounded in loving kindness. Instead, this court of Gentiles was now full of things for sale. But it wasn't only the foreigners the religious leaders had not been caring for. It was their own people. Jesus went for 2 tables when he overturned them. The money changers, where they were taking advantage of those who had imperfect money to put into the offering, and they were charging, trust me on this, interest. And the sellers of pigeons. Now, a pigeon was the sacrifice offered for the poorest of families. The prices were exorbitant for everything on the Temple Mount, even for the poorest of the poor. It's true that Jesus was righteously angry at such abuses. But there was more than his anger taking place. Remember, Mark said that he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. This is Monday, and he's going to follow it up on Tuesday. Jesus didn't only clean house, he was taking charge. Now, for a moment, remember our paradigm. Jesus claims to be Messiah. The people accept him, number 2. He tests them, number 3. And they reject him, number 4. Dr. Doug Bookman, an esteemed scholar on the life of Christ, says taking back the Temple Mount may be the most messianic act of Jesus' ministry. It's like he says, you worshiped me and called me yesterday your king. I will go to the heart of where the king should reign from, the Temple Mount, and I will take it back. They cheered him on Sunday, and he's testing them on Monday. In the very place where they are least likely to submit is where he tests them, their pocketbooks. The Temple Mount at Passover was equivalent to our Black Friday frenzies. Everybody is selling and expecting to make money. And at the top of the food chain sit Annas and Caiaphas, taking a portion of everything that comes into them. And make no mistake about it, probably paying Rome out of those proceeds so that they can have the right to serve as high priest the next year as well. Everyone is selling, and everyone's expecting to make money. And Jesus, in one act, shuts it down. As he teaches them using Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7, where he reminds them that this house that was a house of prayer, they have made a den of thieves. And as he does that, just picture that, beneath one of those pillars, crowds begin to swell, people begin to come, and the religious leaders realize they have a problem. In fact, the text says, as he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house should be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because the crowd was astonished at his teaching. There is one other event that takes place on this particular Monday, the Passion Week, that is worth noting. In fact, we find it in Mark 11, verse 12. Now remember, they were staying in Bethany the night before, a safe place for Jesus to stay, because the scribes would not be able to find him there. And on the following day, that is Monday morning, when they came from Bethany, heading into Jerusalem, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. Now, the very next day, on Tuesday, we're going to read that as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And they noticed that the fig tree had been withered. Now, here's a great question for you. Why is that an important part of this particular story on Monday? Why, of all the events that could have been included, did the Spirit of God include this event? The ESV Study Bible adds a really helpful note. It says, since the fruit of the fig tree begins to appear about the same time as the leaves, or a little after, the appearance of leaves in full bloom should have indicated that fruit, even if it's just the form of green figs, was already growing. Listen to this. Jesus' actions here have symbolic importance, signifying the hypocrisy of all who have the appearance that they are bearing fruit, but in fact are not. Let me give you that again. Jesus' actions here have symbolic importance, signifying the hypocrisy of all who have the appearance that they are bearing fruit, but in fact are not. In fact, in this specific reference, we know that he's speaking to Israel. Since in the Old Testament, the fig tree often serves as a metaphor for Israel. And his cursing of the fig tree is as if to say, you have the appearance of fruit, but you are really fruitless. You have turned away from God to empty ritual and your legalism. It's a visual parable to signify Jesus' search for the true fruit of worship, prayer, and righteousness in the Jewish nation and its religious practices. That's what the ESV Study Bible says, and that's accurate because it applies to Israel. But I think it's also a charge to each of us. Are we motivated like the religious leaders of Jesus' day? Do we insist on being happy unless we won't be happy unless we can have everything our way? Or do we take advantage of others? How about the marginalized? Do we reach out to those who aren't like us to introduce them to the true and living God? The New Testament, you may remember, refers to our bodies as a temple of the Holy Spirit. It says we were bought with a price. Are our temples being used for God's glory? Or would Jesus today find us fruitless? I'm Phil Moser, and this has been Take 20, the final days of Jesus.